They are not only stopping Ukraine, which is now the symbol of that struggle, but they are also stopping Georgia. So when you look at it from that standpoint, the motivation of these European powers is to ensure that a big power in Europe under threat, which is a nuclear power in Europe, is neutralized. That, on the face of it, is the motivation of the Europeans. France and the United Kingdom, which have what I call a colonial hangover. They still believe that they should control the world, and they see that the control of the world is slipping through their fingers, and they are trying to reassert themselves. But it's not going to happen. There are new kids on the block. There is Russia, there is China, there is India, there is Brazil, and I believe that Africa is also going to begin to emerge, and of course, the ever-present United States of America. And I think messages are being sent very clearly, particularly to Macron, the president of France, and to Keir Starmer, who is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Tone down, tone down. The world has seen this. You are not there, or if you are there, you are not active participants. Don't have sharp appetite for conflict. And I hope that they are listening to the world, and they will listen and do that which is right. Sue for peace and persuade Zelensky to sue for peace. There are certain battles that are not worth fighting. This is the Trump message. Choose your battles carefully. And one of the battles not to fight now is to escalate the war between Ukraine and Russia, because we know what it is. It is a proxy war where Europe is fighting Russia. The Russian-Ukrainian war has really caused many balls to be in the air. And it is brought about those balls in the air because the scrutiny of the world is on existing institutions. And when we talk about the Ukrainian-Russian war, we must also not forget the Hamas-Israel war, to the extent that it has contributed. It has put scrutiny, contributed to this. It has put scrutiny, for example, on the United Nations. The United Nations has almost been impotent in the face of all these. Resolutions are brought in and then they are passed. Some of them are vetoed, and yet nobody listens to these statements that are coming from the United Nations. I sympathize with Antonio Guterres, moving from one meeting to the other, making this or that statement about this war, but nobody is listening. You see, in the International Court of Justice at The Hague, they make decisions which nobody even bothers about. So that going forward, one sees a number of things in terms of the existing post-World War II institutions. Let's look at NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was an organization that was put together and became an organization that was used by the Western world to mean Europe as we know it and the United States of America to be a body that would guard the member states against the Soviet Union at that time. It is in that context that we must also see the Warsaw Pact that brought together the nations that were inclined to the Soviet Union, so that there was a justification. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, at one time there was even a thought that Russia would be a part of NATO. But we have seen that change very dramatically, with the consequence that within NATO itself, the big underwriter of NATO, being the United States of America, is now saying, we've been looking after you for too long, we've been paying the bill for too long, and therefore we think that the time is now for you to pay the bills. And this is coming at a time when the non-traditional European countries also want to join NATO. And that is the context in which Ukraine thought that in order to immunize themselves against the power of Russia, let us join NATO. But the situation has changed also. The Americans are saying, really, why should we be in NATO at all? Does it benefit us? And if we are in talking terms and we can forge an alliance with Russia, then why? Why should we even bother to be part of NATO? And here the Russians say we are willing to even help the United States of America to negotiate with Iran regarding their nuclear arsenal. If that happens, the continued stay of the United States of America in NATO is something that may become very shaky. So never say never. NATO may find itself with its membership reducing. Germany, after the post-war in their pacifist constitution, also restricted their defense budget. They are now beginning to say that we must look after ourselves. Once they acquire the ability to look after themselves, would they want to stay in NATO? Remember also the United Kingdom got out of the European Union. If they continue to be outside of the European Union, will the continental European countries be comfortable with them in NATO? So there are too many moving parts in that regard. And the parts are moving in such a manner that if the Trump presidency continues on the same trajectory, we may have a totally different reorganization within Western Europe, which then brings us to the United Nations. You know, prior to the coming into being of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945, we had the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, having been created after the World War I, was discovered to have lost its value. I am almost taking the view that the UN must also be reorganized. The time is now. 80 years after the Second World War, the UN must be re-examined. Is it effective? Is it the body that was created in 1945 in San Francisco? Are institutions effective? Or the time is now for the world to rethink the UN and to re-energize it in a different way. That debate is one that I think is alive now. The African countries are also saying we've been part of this movement, but we have never enjoyed status as permanent members. And within the African Union, I always wonder when they talk about the 2 seats, is it going to, are they going to be divided? Are you going to tell the Maghreb, choose one so that Egypt becomes a permanent member? When you come to sub-Saharan Africa, are you going to choose Nigeria or South Africa? So these are issues which are coming into the play, and I see a world which is born out of the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in between Israel and Hamas, which is going to reorder herself. The only issue, of course, is that the term of a US president is very short, 4 years, and some of these things may not be concluded during that period, but things have started moving in earnest, and who knows, they may move so fast, so quickly, before we know it, things will have changed and changed dramatically. In other words, what one sees is a very interesting scenario going forward. The next 4 years are going to be historic.